You're listening to Server Soundbites, the official podcast of Server, the leading global relocation and moving services company. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to Server Soundbites, where we aim to connect, inform, educate, and entertain our listeners. I'm your host today, Judee. I'm the Director of Global Advisory Services here at Serva. And today we're going to be deep diving into global mobility and specifically around tax. We really want to understand the risks, the reality, and the strategic collaboration and the opportunities between all the aspects of global mobility, specifically with tax. We'll go into the HR mobility space that these professionals face when managing global employees and company structures. I'd like to also challenge some of these outdated perceptions and highlight key differences between personal income tax and PE risk, which PE, I had to learn myself, stands for permanent establishment. We'll also discuss how tax and RMCs like Serva could be collaborating and should be collaborating more closely to support our clients and their employees in this rapidly growing geopolitical climate. Here with me today is Rajiv Thadani. Now, before I continue, I just want to confirm, Rajiv, am I saying your name correctly in pronunciation?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Great, of course. And he is from KPMG, who's a principal and who's been in the mobility industry for over 30 years. So, Rajiv, I just want to start something with a little bit small, kind of a bit small, but we're going to get into it a little bit bigger. You've been in the industry, and I just mentioned for about 30 years. That's quite some time. And so, what is the most common fear you find in mobility and HR teams throughout your career, and how do you deal with all this global tax compliance?
Thank you, Judy, firstly, for inviting me to Server Soundbites. By the way, I love the name. Anything that has bites in it is always going to be a fun conversation, except we don't have any food in front of us. So hopefully we'll get a chance to
Next time.
share a meal sometime. Uh, I wouldn't say that it's a fear. I think it's sort of the evolution of what I've seen over the 30 years in the industry is everyone is on a journey, right? Our clients are on a journey. We as service providers are on a journey. And I think what I find is, I categorize our clients into three groupings, right? One is clients that have done this for a very long time and have really pushed the needle, have been very creative, have been very, embracing innovation, embracing technology, and doing all the things that help us push the needle, right? With all of us as service providers, but also internally and how they manage it, whether it's from a cost perspective or from an automation perspective. And then you've got clients that are sort of in that journey, that have just sort of been in the journey for a few years, sort of are still learning the way, learning how to navigate the world of mobility, and are learning as they go along. And obviously, I enjoy working with those clients as well because you're sort of partnering with them and helping them go through that evolution of what their program should look like, right? And then you've got clients that are sort of fairly new, right? And being in Silicon Valley, we work with a lot of startups, right? A lot of folks that are just launching their mobility program, and more often than not, the mobility leader comes from a generic HR background and is being told, "Hey, you now need to manage mobility." So they're very
Yeah.
early in that evolution of what a good program or great program should look like, right? So it's also partnering with them. So I think it's just recognizing in our business that you work with a different set of leaders, right? Some that are those, have been in the business for many years, have done some pretty innovative things, and you have to collaborate with them a little bit differently than how you would collaborate with the folks that are just starting out in the world of mobility or are sort of in the middle in that journey of where they would want their career as well as the program to be, right? So to me, that's sort of what I find has not changed in the last 30 years that I've been in the business, right? Certainly the individuals in those spaces have done different things, but that's it. And honestly, I enjoy that, right? If we had only people in one of those three categories, and that would sort of make it a little bit dull and boring. I think having to work with people in the different evolution is a lot of fun. It's exciting, it's challenging, and I know that's what I really enjoy about the world we live in.
Great. And I think you're right. Even, we can learn different ways from the different levels of people that we work with. I mean, there are some people that might have just gotten into mobility because it was put on their plate, but they have their own backgrounds and
Yeah.
their own experiences that you're like, I never thought of it this way, right?
Yeah.
And so, in terms of presenting a lot of these collaborations and kind of working through, one of the things that we start to talk about is the collaboration between RMCs and, tax providers, and how those worlds are starting to collide, but also try to figure out how do we work together, how do we partner to essentially have the best interest for our clients and their employees. Like, what have you seen in the past couple like years or months or anything in that regard?
I would say that that's probably one of the most positive outcomes I've seen in our industry. I would say in the last decade or so, maybe even a little bit longer than that, is where sometimes it's being driven by a client mandate asking us to do
Mm,
more together, like play well in the sandbox, right, is one part, but then also play well to then drive efficiency and growth, right? It's going back to that the very experienced mobility leaders that are pushing us to do that. But I think it's also comes from the different providers that are in the ecosystem realizing that, yeah, maybe there are elements of work that we do that compete with each other, but by and large, the big chunk of what server does is not what KPMG does, and vice versa, right? But there are elements of what we
yeah.
do is sort of competing with each other. But I think once we leave that at the door and we think about client as the center of the universe, and we got to make sure that we can deliver a valuable proposition to them by collaborating and doing things together. I think that's what's to me has been a big change in our industry where I remember and I've been in the US for 24 years. I started my career in India for the first 6 years and then moved here. In the last 24 years, I've actually worked with clients in the early part of my career who basically said, you will not speak to my RMC without my permission or without me being on the call. I cannot imagine that happening today. Look, and I don't think it's about sort of conspiring against a client, right? That's not what you're trying to do. You're really trying to help them be
No.
more successful and deliver value to their own internal organization. So to me, that's been an incredible evolution of what I've seen is our clients where it makes sense, pushing us to collaborate more. And it's not just with the RMCs, right? It's also with the immigration providers, which again, we
Yeah.
all compete with each other, but at the same time, we want to do what's right for the client. And we leave that, well, the pieces that we compete on at the door and we come play well in the sandbox and drive value for our clients and how we collaborate.
Yeah. We don't bite, we promise. We're the RMCs, but we don't bite ourselves. I mean, we call this service sound bites,
Yeah.
but we would rather share a meal with you in that regard. So for sure. And so, I mean, look, I think recently you were also just on the ERC as a board member. So that in itself is kind of, crossing a bit of that line to see how the other side works, right? How has that experience changed your outlook?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting. I was told when I got the final call on being invited to join the board after the very rigorous process that they had, was they wanted a representative from the tax community, which I think for a while they did not have on the board, and I thought that's pretty intriguing, right? So yes, I'm bringing my tax background, but I'm also gaining a lot from all of these different service lines that are represented in the WRC community, right? Not just in the board. And I go back,
Hmm.
I go back to the time that I got involved in our local Bay Area community, which is BAMM, right? Bay Area Mobility Management, which has been it's a fairly large community. They host an annual conference. They host quarterly meetings. The annual conference at its peak, can get up to as high as 450, 475, right? So it's a
Wow.
fairly large, very well attended event. And I remember attending those conferences and always having a point of view on certain sessions not being good enough and always letting
Hmm.
certain members of the board know who were dear friends of mine that, hey, those sessions are not good. And after they had heard me complain a couple of times, they said, okay, Rajiv, here's our proposition for you. Come join us, be part of the conference committee, join us and help us figure out what you can do. Let's see what you can bring to the table, right? So I literally was pushed into the deep end, and honestly, I still had a very I'd like to believe a tax bias. I thought tax was the most important thing in the world of mobility. Nothing else was important enough. Immigration was not important. Relocation, temp housing, none of that matters. The tax is the only important thing. And I very quickly realized, and I thank William Taylor from from our community who pushed me and nudged me to get involved. Who basically said you're gonna get your eyes are gonna open and you're gonna have a little bit of appreciation for the community and the industry we work in, and I'm thankful for that because it made me realize that there's so much more to mobility than tax, and I just had a better appreciation for what our clients go through, right? I mean, I may be calling them about a
Yeah.
tax issue, but they're dealing with finding housing for the CFO who's just relocating, and they're scrambling like nothing else is important to them but taking care of that important piece, right? So it made me appreciate a whole lot of what happens in our industry and all the stakeholders that work in the industry, right? Beyond relocation, immigration, and tax, there's a whole lot of other downstream providers that have to do a bunch of different things to make that come to life and help our clients be successful. So to me, that sort of was the start of that journey, and sort of WRC was the next step in that process. Uh, and so I, obviously appreciate having that perspective, right? That I had served on the BAMM board for almost 8 years, and then
Hmm.
rolled off a couple of years ago, and then had the chance of being involved in the WRC
Yeah.
board. And I'll tell you, WRC is also going through an evolution right now, right? I think their brand had been impacted for a while. I mean, whether it was the pandemic, whether it was the shrinking participation in their conferences, and they've really, I think, I give a lot of credit to the board, right? Not just me, right? The board that was in place before me, as well as our CEO Anupam, who has done a phenomenal job in doing. He did this road tour. He went and met with people across the country, got feedback, and
Yeah.
has truly doubled down on content, right? Like his focus is let's produce really good content, and that's going to drive participation in these conferences. And I think we had a phenomenal attendance last year, and I think this year is going to be equally good. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I always, I have a lot of people come to me and say, I want to do more for the industry. And I always tell them, get involved in a regional, right? Get involved in some element of helping a local conference, and you'll have so much appreciation for what it takes to not only create a conference of that magnitude, but also appreciation for what everyone brings to the table, right? And I think you just have to realize that each and every one of us plays an important role. And my bias that tax is the most important thing. I still think it's important, but probably not the most important thing.
Of course.
Is has changed over a period of time.
No, I mean, I could say there are times where tax was the most important thing. When it came to tax season and, that April, May, June kind of time frame, like nothing else mattered at that point.
Yeah.
Like we were like I come from an in-house background of around 12 years. So like you're right, it depends on the day, on the hour that we've discussed, and like depends on what the priorities are of the mobility team. Like we were scrambling on whether we were going to get, housing for schooling so that they could register and enroll in that school at the right time. And so that was like one aspect of some things. And then another aspect was also around like, here are their tax filings that were being done in Germany, and then some things that we had to do on some of the trailing income for equity, and then we had to figure out some kind of equalization. So it does vary, and it's interesting because I think one of the things I actually learned early in my career, in immigration, actually, so I started my career in immigration, is one of the partners that told me, she said, immigration is just one aspect of the entire person's move. And she was like, they're dealing with so many other things. And I think back to, when I immigrated into Canada, I was like a 6-year-old, 7-year-old child, and I didn't know anything about anything. But at the end of the day, I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, there were so many things that had to fall into place for us to have a home, have the proper immigration structures, everything. Like, and my parents didn't come through with a company, and so I can't even imagine well, I can now because I'm in the industry and we've worked on this industry for quite some time, but it is actually quite complex, but it's also really holistic. And I think it's quite human all at the same time, right? And so I think in terms of all of the things of understanding these different levels of client evolutions, where they are in terms of their career, they might also go into different parts of mobility. They might be more strategic, more operational, more policy driven, and so forth. What do you say is your secret sauce for managing these different types of clients, and how you're dealing with such complex topics with different providers like Serva, as an example?
Yeah, look, I think you know, I always tell our clients and our teams that there can never be a one size fits all, right? The way I would interact with you at Server is going to be
Mm-hmm.
reflective of the way the organization works and operates, and figuring out what's the sweet spot in how we can collaborate, versus how I would be doing it with another RFC. Or even with our
Yeah.
clients, right? The way you interact with a certain client will be dependent on their culture, their individual leadership style, etc. Right? So I think understanding that is so important and critical, because sometimes, and I know in the early part of my career, I would try and fit everything into one box, right? Like that. This is the way we do it, right? This is just the way we do it. And look, I think there's a lot of value in standardization. Make no mistake about that. But you've got to have a little bit of flexibility, right?
Yeah.
I remember one of my colleagues many years ago shared the distinction between consistently flexible versus flexible consistency, right? So there's a big
I like that.
difference, right? Because if you're constantly trying to be flexible, you're going to struggle with coming up with a standard process, right? Which sometimes in mobility,
Exceptions everywhere.
yeah.
Yeah.
Versus, having a model that allows you to be slightly flexible to allow for that one-off exception. Otherwise, you're gonna constantly be running into issues. So to me, that's the key, right? Is making sure you understand the culture of the organization, the leadership style, and then making sure that your
Mm.
teams can align with what needs to be done. Look, in the Bay Area, we work with clients in the tech sector, right? So, a certain way in how you work with the tech sector. But we also have clients that are not in the tech sector, right? We have a client in financial services. We have a client in the auto industry. And yes, you
Hmm.
would think that, yeah, all of corporate America works the same, but in reality, it doesn't, right? And you've got to be understanding of that culture, of not just the company culture or the industry culture, but also about the individual leadership style of the folks that you work with. I'll also
Yeah.
I'll also I'll also make a point about what I mentioned earlier about the evolution of the clients and the different spaces. But what you may also find is that you could be working with a client that is extremely experienced and is pushing the needle, always driving innovation.
Hmm.
But they're also working with internal stakeholders. They're working with their finance team, with their payroll team,
Yeah.
and they may not be in that evolution of where the client is, right? So you're going to have to sort of navigate that a little bit, where you're working with a client who's extremely experienced and is expecting everything to be done in a certain way, but their finance team may not have the experience of working
Hmm.
with accruals related to mobility. So then you're having to kind of come to that level of their understanding to make sure that they are processing things. And that's been one of the biggest issues we've run into, is where we're assuming that everyone is at the same level of understanding and evolution, and then you end up realizing that,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
payroll didn't really follow the instructions we asked them to do, or finance didn't accrue certain things. And that's kind of where you realize that there's a bit of a gap, and that's where you end up driving those. So I think having that understanding of where everyone is in that process and their understanding of mobility is really, really important. And look, I think the reality is that mobility is not as big as it used to be when it comes to numbers, right? When you look at traditional
Hmm.
expat assignments, they're not, the numbers are shrinking. So when you go to payroll and say, yeah, you got to work on these 10 W-2s for these expats, they're like, yeah, I'm working on
Hmm.
10,000 of those. What's another 10? So sometimes it doesn't get the time and attention that it deserves, right? And so just making sure that
Hmm.
those 10 get the time and attention, because it's not your standard payroll. It's got a lot of this mobility related stuff that needs to be reported. And so making sure you're helping clients navigate those pieces so that you're driving clean and good compensation reporting.
Yeah, I think that that really resonates well. Like I've worked in industries in-house in finance, tech, retail, and so they all differ
Yeah,
in all of their different organizational cultures. Like, you know, the tech was a startup. Well, not a startup, but like, you know, a mid-sized startup kind of thing. They've been in the industry for a while, but I got so much exposure to the payroll and the legal team and the HR team and the business lines themselves. And so when I had to explain why my budget was so volatile. It was like, I don't know
yeah,
who they're going to hire. They could hire somebody, you know, just across the border in the US coming to Canada, or they could find somebody in Hong Kong.
yeah,
And then those costs are going to vary so differently. And I could hire somebody who is a single person, or they could end up hiring somebody who is, you know, married with three children. All of those things are variables that, you know, we can't
yeah,
really control because the skills are the skills, right?
yeah,
And so I think just even that awareness to my finance and the payroll team is was a light bulb for them. It was like, oh my gosh, there's a reason why we
yeah,
can't keep your budget so stagnant and so forth. And they came to the realization pretty quickly once we started to see them show them numbers. And then I think, you know, I agree with organizational culture. Look, I used to work at Lululemon. We were all about yoga. I had my vendors go in and do onboarding just like our own. And so I'll be honest, there were some times where I had some partners coming and do yoga with with our with our employees just so that they know like
yeah.
the actual
The
value
culture, yeah,
of
yeah,
exactly and like what we are actually working towards. And so with all of these things changing and shifting, I want to get back into that concept of agility because I think we're just coming out of, I mean, not we're just coming out of, but we've been out of the pandemic world for quite some time now. You know, a good 3 years, I would say now, where things have started to pick up again. But you know, we've opened Pandora's box with remote and hybrid work, and everyone is trying to figure out, you know, how do you make these types of situations work? Can I work on a beach in Cancun? You know, we've talked about this as like, yeah, I would love to work at a beach in Cancun, and just, you know, even right now, the ability for us to have this conversation. You're in the Bay Area, I'm here in Toronto. The reality is so much more complex, but there's a lot of opportunities. Like, how do you navigate this with clients?
yeah. You know, before I respond to that, and you realize
Yeah.
I love sharing stories. So I'm going to share a story. It's a pre-pandemic story about being agile as a service provider. We had a situation
Mm.
where we had a very senior executive living overseas who had a green card, and you know,
Hmm.
having a green card comes with some U.S. tax consequences, and so
Yes.
they the executive decided that they were going to turn in their green card so they did not have ongoing tax issues because they were not going to live in
Yeah.
the US anymore. And so they had engaged us to help them through that process. We completed, there's a form that needs to be completed. And then at the time, you had to go into the local consulate and hand over the form and get the green
Hmm.
card. And there was a whole process to it. Right? I won't get into all of that details. But essentially, we worked on it for, you know, a month and a half. We scheduled the appointment. We took the executive and his spouse to the consulate to hand over the green card and the forms, etc.
Hmm.
The husband signs the form, hands it over, gives his green card. It's the wife's turn, and like she's like bawling, like she's crying. She's like, I don't
Oh
want to give up the
no.
green card. Like literally in the middle of the consulate, I don't want to give up the green card. This is too emotional for me. We got married in the US. We bought our first house in the US. Our kids were
Oh
born in the
wow.
US. I don't want to break ties with the US. I don't care about the tax consequences. Like literally in the middle of that consulate, the
Oh
the
wow.
the colleague of ours who then had to sort of become a marriage counselor of sorts, right, to help them. So they basically decided not to go through
Yeah.
with the return, and the consulate officer was nice enough to say, okay, that's fine. Gave it back, and they, I think they're still green card holders, and they may have become citizens. But I mean, it's not something that you would deal with. Like it's not a tax issue, but I think it's recognizing that
No.
you need that kind of emotional, empathy or whatever you want to call it, compassion, right? To make sure that you're understanding that, yes, giving up a green card is a good tax answer for you, but maybe there's an emotional element to it that
Attachment.
honestly, the husband and wife had not spoken about it, right? He just assumed that she would go along with it, and when it came time, she just wasn't able to do it. She's like, it's just too emotional for me. I don't want to do it. So I
Oh,
keep
wow.
I keep telling our clients that a lot of times we make these, we're trying to come up with some creative tax strategies. We have to factor that in, right? We have to factor the human element of what the individual may
Mm,
be going through, right? Yes, it's a great tax answer for the organization or for the individual, but maybe it's not the right answer for their family. And let's make sure we validate that so that we don't have a situation where you end up you've done 6 months of planning, you end up at the end of the road, and then you're not able to go through with it because there's an emotional element that we didn't factor in. So to me, it's a
yeah.
story I love sharing, not because of kind of the incident, but the fact that it required someone in our team to sort of help them navigate sort of a very touchy issue that they were dealing with, which kind of had some emotional consequences. You talk about
Yeah.
and then you talk about the pandemic, right? So I think we've seen multiple versions of sort of something similar happening, right? Where people have said, "I'm going to go work from Cancun," or "I want to go work from, I have ailing parents that I want to go and spend time with, and I want to go and work from there. It's a
Hmm.
big deal. We have an office in that country, China, India, wherever, right?" And I think it's you as a mobility leader, you don't want to be the one that's saying no all the time, right? You want to make sure you're enabling the business, but you're also wanting to make sure that you have a responsibility to your organization, that you're not creating unnecessary cost or risk for the organization, right? So you got to have that
Mm,
fine balance and okay, what's acceptable, what's not. Yes, I know technically this is the requirement, but what's the element of risk that we might be running into? Look, immigration you don't want to be messing around with, right? And look at what's happening around us here in the US, right? There's a huge focus on
oh, yeah.
making sure people are following the laws. We're going to see that happen a little bit more across the world. So you want to make sure on the tax side, right? You obviously have some risk there, but just making sure you're doing that due diligence before you're allowing any of those, sort of what I call out of the norm exceptions to your people to do things that they need to do. And I suppose you
Hmm.
want to be an enabler because you also don't want them to not tell you, right? You don't want them to kind of sneak in and do things so that because they know that the answer is going to be no, right? So
Hmm.
I think we've seen a lot of that happen during the pandemic where companies are like, look, we recognize and stuff, right? We recognize you've not seen your parents for 3 years, that the borders have been shut. You want to go and you want to go there for an extended duration of time. Let's figure out what makes sense, right? Maybe we can't have you go for 6 months, right? Because that's going to create a whole lot of risk. But
Yeah.
maybe there's a way for us to navigate the work that you do while you're in that country. What sort of a legal status do you have? All of those elements, and then what are the tax
Hmm.
consequences? And it's back to the piece you spoke about in the introduction about corporate permanent establishment, right? That that
Yeah.
can that can be a huge issue for organizations that if they're not thinking and planning for these issues. What I've found pre-pandemic, if you were lucky, you would probably you could get your corporate tax team's attention as a mobility leader to help you focus on P because they would say, okay, this is not important. We've got other bigger things to deal with. I think post-pandemic,
Hmm.
I think corporate tax departments have realized that the mobility of individuals who are wanting to work remotely in these locations can immediately trigger a huge issue for us. And so I think our clients are getting the time and attention of their corporate tax colleagues now. And I'm like, that's again, it's back to what's a big positive that's happened. That's a huge positive is that even internally, there are stakeholders that you're able to engage with a whole lot more. I'm not saying that they were not engaged, but I think you're able to engage with them a whole lot more today than you were, maybe a decade ago, maybe even pre-pandemic, where that used to always be the struggle that you couldn't get their time and attention because they were dealing with other important issues. And now
Of
I think they're
course.
realizing that people working remotely or people on these extended business trips can easily
Yeah.
trigger a huge issue for the organization. And look, I think there's also been an evolution in countries like I think India is notorious for that, where their rules on permanent establishment is really, really strict. So you could immediately
Yeah,
shift that very, very quickly, right? Even though you may not trigger an employer-employee tax issue, you could almost immediately trigger a permanent establishment issue because there's been some case laws on it more recently. So it's certainly getting the time and attention, which is a good thing, right? Now that you have the time and attention, engage with them in a productive way to make sure
for
that you're
sure.
getting their help for what you need to do.
And it's interesting because I think the in the industry that we work in, there are so many risks that have involved people's personal lives at the
Yeah,
end of the day, right? Personal and corporate lives
yeah,
that we have to think of. And I think there was a time where somebody that I was the in-house person, and they kept getting triggered for business travel, and because they were working with like with clients across the borders, and the next thing you know, they just met up with the wrong border agency, and he was like, nope, it looks like you were flagged X number of times. He decided to like be a bit of a grump and wake up at the wrong side of the bed, and who knows what it was that happened, but he ended up getting like banned. And then that triggered so many other things around immigration, where it was like he couldn't go to his friend's wedding in that country anymore. Like, it doesn't just impact him from a business standpoint, it like impacted him personally. And so it is interesting to see these. I'm not saying that like that's a good thing that now we're getting a lot of awareness of these considerations, but they're real. The risks that we've kind
yeah,
of been saying over and over again, they are real, and they're coming a little bit more realistic. And so kind of, if you don't mind, going back with all the stories in terms of the pandemic and understanding what did we learn from the pandemic, right? How did you like talk about agility in those years, right? Those are probably like, I don't think I've ever pivoted as like that was the one word. I think that was the one meme we used all the time. That Friends
yeah,
meme where like Ross and they're like pivoting a couch, and it was the biggest word that everybody always used is
yeah,
how do you pivot in this ever changing, constantly changing
yeah.
like environment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our, and I don't think this is true only for tax, right? It was true for all parts of mobility, right? That we all had to pivot and we all had to be agile. What was interesting at that point in time was in the initial days, right, there was this huge focus on duty of care, right? You wanted to make sure your employees were
Mm-hmm.
fine, they were healthy, they were not impacted, and their mental health was good because I had a bunch of my team members that were living by themselves and had no interactions, no social interactions. So it was really hard. And I
Yeah.
think those virtual get-togethers got old very quickly, right? They were not quite as fun and
Can't
interesting.
do virtual happy hours like that
Yeah,
anymore, you know?
no, yeah, it was tough. So I think there was this huge focus on duty of care, but then very quickly people realized that hey, like people are doing some stuff that may be creating some issues, right? I remember one of our clients had a bunch of folks that were living in California that decided to move to Texas, didn't tell anyone, and changed their state
Yeah.
residence state to Texas, right? Which created some issues for them because the company didn't have a local presence in Texas, right? So there was this,
Mm,
one of many examples of and again, employees were not doing it because they were trying to hide or skirt some rules. They just wanted to be closer to where kind of their families were, right? And so
family,
decided to
friends,
move, and
yeah.
yeah, and it ended up being a tax advantage answer for them, and that certainly was fine. But it created some issues for the company when they realized that people were going in and changing their state tax residency, which could create some issues for them. So I think that's when people realized that hey, we had to continue to have this focus on duty of care, but we also had to come up with some guardrails, right? Because you as an organization couldn't
Mm,
be couldn't be caught in the middle of triggering a huge tax issue for yourself. We had examples of individuals in some parts of Europe that were stuck, right? That they were visiting for a client or for an extended family visit, and then the border shut down and they couldn't leave, right? And they got stuck
yeah.
for a fairly long period of time that they would end up triggering residency, which meant that they would end up triggering taxation in that country. And we had an example where
Mm,
one of the European countries issued guidance that hey, if you're stuck because the borders are shut, and your intent was never to be here, right? You would have to prove that. Then we will not hold you as a resident, which means you don't have to worry about
that's good.
taxation. 6 months later, they realized that, hey, we're not getting any of that tax collections we were hoping on because The world is different. So they're like, oh, that notice we issued 6 months ago, it's not valid anymore. So they undid it.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, we had individuals who were then caught up with these huge tax liabilities that we had to help
Oh, wow.
navigate, and it became a sticky issue, and we were fortunate enough to have help navigate some of those issues. So there was a lot. Even the authorities were going through a lot of evolution, right? Trying to figure out, okay, what can I
Yeah.
allow, what can I not allow? That whole concept of nomad visas became very popular. That, oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
come work in the Caribbean for a year, right? And there was a bunch of our clients who had employees lining up and saying, "Yeah, I'm going to go work in the Caribbean, right? They're giving me a nomad visa for a year. It's on my own dime." But what they didn't realize was, well, that's great that you've got a visa to go and work there, but that doesn't mean you don't have any kind of tax issues you're going to be dealing with, right? Because you're going and working in
Hmm.
another country. So I think we all had to kind of help navigate that without losing that focus on. It was a tough time, right? We were living in some really tough times. We were dealing with some serious health issues, right, with our families, our
Oh,
friends, and
yeah.
etc. Right. So that focus of duty of care we still had to have that as our main focus, but then also make sure we're helping our employees and our teams and our clients navigate that, right, with what had to be
Yeah.
done, which would not trigger an incremental cost for the organization.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a clear balance of trying to figure out when is it appropriate to provide such exceptions for a duty of care in such extreme circumstances. Like we don't even have to talk about the pandemic. We could talk about current geopolitical shifts that are happening right now,
Yeah,
like the Ukraine-Russian conflict, like a lot of things that are happening over there. And how do you support that duty of care for employees in that area or in those surrounding areas? Like how do you make sure that their safety comes first and
yeah,
foremost, right? And I could, for myself, I kind of understand it from a COVID standpoint, like funny, not funny, haha story, funny weird story, I would say. For me, my aunt was actually the first confirmed diagnosed COVID patient in Ireland. And so she's a emergency nurse, and that's how she got it. And
yeah,
so, all of these things, just the first and foremost things we were wondering is like, we didn't, at that time, nobody knew what was happening and nobody knew what was going on. And
yeah,
so we were wondering, is she going to be okay? She's, a nurse. She's got a lot of healthcare. Thankfully, she's back on her feet and all that stuff. But at that time, we didn't have any of the health support or the knowledge that we're going through. So even that duty of care of her own, like hospital and the company that she worked for, had to make sure that she had all of those pieces to make sure that she was taken care of. And now to think of that on an international level for like our employees or clients and so forth, like that's a whole other like spectrum on top of taxes, right? And so I think, those are things that we really love to like, we have to remember and kind of reground ourselves that there is a balance that we have to navigate around this as well, right? And so, yeah, in terms of like, what are we going to do now with what we've learned from COVID? What's our next step? Understanding the differences between income tax risk, personal income tax risk, but then also PE risk. Like, how does one impact the other? Now we've literally opened more Pandora's boxes.
yeah.
What's next?
Yeah, and I'll share my own personal story. In November of 2021, my wife and I flew to Zimbabwe because our daughter was playing in a tournament there, and we got there the week of Thanksgiving. Which, if you remember the timeline, 2021 November was when Omicron virus, or the Omicron strain,
Yeah.
broke out, and it was suspected that it was came from the African region, right? And we were right there in the heart of
Hmm.
in the heart of Zimbabwe. A few days in, her tournament got cancelled, so they were going to fly out the next day. And at that time, obviously everyone had to get the infamous RT-PCR test for COVID
Yep.
before you could get on a flight. And so my wife and I went to a local lab. We got tested, and we both tested positive. Right? We were in Zimbabwe, and
Oh
obviously
my
we had to
gosh.
break the news to our daughter, and we said, "Hey, you got to go back to the U.S. with your team. because, and if you remember, borders were shutting down, right? US was not allowing
Yeah.
a lot of travel from Africa or from the African region. So my wife and I, like,
Yeah.
we were petrified. We thought we were going to be stuck in Africa for a while because I'd heard all these stories of my clients, right, who were stuck because the borders were shut and they couldn't get
Of course.
and we thought we were going to be stuck. And again, not that we were in Africa that was the concern, but the fact that we were going to be stuck at a place that was not home, right, was what was
Mm.
stressing us out. And obviously, kids were in the U.S. Family was in the U.S. And so we were stuck for almost 10 days. We couldn't fly. We were stuck
Oh,
in this
wow.
hotel. The hotel was fantastic. They took really good care of us, made sure we had
Mm.
food and all of that. There was a lot of Netflix and Amazon Prime and YouTube that was being consumed. A little bit of work, right?
Nice.
Trying to just stay up to date. But it was really hard. And I've never seen my wife, who's a very strong person, I've never seen her be as stressed as she was because she honestly thought we were going to be there for a while. And
Yeah.
fortunately, we were able to test negative, and then we got on a flight. It was a long journey through like four different airports. And again, I had to lean on the KPMG travel desk to help me with my travel back, right? Because
Yeah.
it was a personal trip and I had to pay for it, but I was able to lean on them, and it was exceptional, right? The way they were able to help us because they said, "Yeah, this is not a work trip, but we're still going to help you get out of Africa, right? Because we know you
That's
want to get
lovely.
home."
Yeah.
And so it made me realize. I think that was sort of a huge sort of building off what I shared with the BAMM story, right? It made me realize that this is what our employees go through, right? When they are moving, the anxiety that they have to deal with, tax may or may not be the first thing on their mind, right? Maybe it's getting out of a country where there might be a war breaking out, there might be some geopolitical crisis going on, or whatever that may, health pandemic, tsunami. You go through a bunch of these things that have happened over the last 20, 30 years, and it makes you realize that it's so important to have that focus of duty of care. And then you think about,
Yeah.
okay, now that we've figured out the duty of care, let's help them navigate how we can minimize the immigration tax and all these other risks that they will be running into. So it's a huge for me, it's a huge learning. It's something that I know I was really stressed about being in a hospital and getting some medical care, right? But again, I think the care
Yeah.
I got was exceptional. My wife and I were going into this hospital where the local doctor said, look, there's no cure for this. But what I can give you is I can give you energy so you're able to travel when you do test negative, right? So just being able to
That's great.
navigate that was a huge thing. Uh, I mean, I just can't say enough good things about Zimbabwe because the help and support we got from the local folks was exceptional, and some who are still in touch and are still checking up on us. And to me, that's
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 so
going to be a
sweet.
lifelong relationship we're going to have with those people that help my wife and I navigate through what we experience. And I think I'm not saying that everyone should experience something like that, but once you do, right, you appreciate and value what
Yeah.
mobility, what anxiety people go through, and being able to bring that level of empathy, right, to help them navigate that. Now let's go back to
Yeah.
the question that you asked, which was personal tax versus PE, right, which is hopefully a little bit more fun than getting stuck in
Yeah.
Norway with COVID.
There's pros and cons to both
Yeah,
sides, but
yeah.
yeah, let's hear it.
So obviously, as I mentioned, right, I think we are finding that a lot of countries are getting more and more aggressive with kind of the
Mm.
evaluation of PE, right? I spoke about India. India has become notorious in the last few years, where it's very strict, and there's a very generous interpretation they take of what's considered a PE, right? So, and unfortunately or fortunately, right, we've got people that are not as knowledgeable, and sometimes it's the employees themselves who are like, yeah, if I'm going for less than 6 months, there's no issue. What do I need to worry about, right? And that may be true from a personal income tax perspective, assuming there's conditions that are being met.
Mm-hmm.
But it may or may not be true from a PE perspective, right? Because if the individual is in that
Yeah.
country working and doing certain duties and responsibilities, they could almost immediately
Yeah.
trigger a corporate tax issue for their organization, which can be huge, significantly substantial, right? So that's why I think back to the point I made earlier, right? When you've got corporate tax being involved and wanting a seat at the table to help us navigate some of these risks, we've got to make sure we're tapping into it and making. And again, the idea is not to say no, right? Because you want to be supportive and helpful for your employee base, but at the same time, you don't want it to be where it's going to cost you bazillion dollars, right? Because of what you're trying to do for your organization. Yeah. So it's got to have a
Oh
balance, right?
yeah. For sure. And I think it's interesting because you touched upon so many different points there that I kind of want to just see where we can fit in some of these pieces because one, I want to call out like you mentioned Zimbabwe and their, the system that they had, the healthcare support, all of the different pieces, and then on top of that, the KPMG, like the travel team, the travel desk that helped you, even though it was a personal trip, that was an ecosystem in itself, right? To kind of figure out, okay, your PCR test officially now came negative. Okay, here's the support that you can get to the energy for it to have energy so that you can travel. The travel desk gave you the routes on which is appropriate and which are available for you and your wife. And so that was an ecosystem in itself. And so I think mobility it as an industry is an
Yeah.
ecosystem, right? So how are we like in terms of what you think is um, kind of evolving with our industry as service provider partners, internal stakeholders themselves, like how do you recommend or advise clients and how to do these partnerships with other service providers, even like directly or even with each other?
And again, sorry, I'll continue my Zimbabwe story and I'll come back to, as I said,
Yeah,
I warned you earlier. I love sharing stories.
yeah,
So
I love this.
one of the elements of the Zimbabwe trip was I don't know what the exact term for it is, but there is some challenges with their currency where I was able to withdraw money, and this is my standard process. Whenever I land in a foreign country, I go to the local ATM and I withdraw local cash, right? Because then, and I found that that's usually the cheapest, right? If you want
Mm-hmm.
to have a little bit of cash on you, obviously you can use credit cards everywhere. But in Zimbabwe, particularly, I struggled with. I was able to withdraw cash, but I got US dollars. It's some currency issue. But then when I went back to withdraw cash, my ATM was not accepted. I'm like, that's weird. And so I
Mm.
asked the local bank, and they're like, sometimes our ATMs don't have enough cash, so they won't. So I went to 3 or 4 ATMs and I couldn't find cash.
Oh, wow.
And I was really stressed about it, thinking I'm going to be here for 10 days. Like I need cash. Like I need to pay for things, and
Yeah,
some certain
pay
things
for
I can pay by
food
credit
and all
card,
that
but
stuff. Yeah.
certain things I can't. Like I need cash, so I had to call my brother to wire money to the local Western Union, and then to be able to go and pick up the money. And that wasn't an
Oh,
easy task
wow.
because I was positive, right? So I couldn't go. Like I was trying to help get
Can you go
someone to go
out?
locally and get it. So it was a bit of a nightmare just trying to navigate that. And then you put that in perspective of what's happened in the recent geopolitical issues, right? With the Ukraine crisis, with what's going on in the Middle East right now. I mean, that's what people are dealing with, right? Like maybe they don't have access to their banks. Maybe they need, and I know a lot of RSCs
Mm-hmm.
helped during that, at least during the Ukraine
Yeah.
crisis, being able to create cash cards and other things to create that currency. And again, had I not been in Zimbabwe, I wouldn't have thought much about it. But to me, it was like I needed cash. I needed to have some money available so that I was able to spend it because credit was not necessarily the first choice of payment there. So it's a good reminder, right? That tells you that okay, you've got to have to figure out a way to navigate these things and to help your employees that are caught up in these very stressful times to be able to not have to worry about, hey, am I going to have access to my money, or how do I pay for
Mm.
local groceries if they're not going to accept my credit card? So I think that's a good foundation for where I think we need to do more with each other, right? Uh, we've got server and KPMG have some common clients. And for the
Mm-hmm.
longest time, we've had any kind of a formal discussion on working together. We've had some loose discussions, but I'd say in the last 6, 8 months, we've sort of connected. I connected with Linda, who sits on the WRC board with me, and that's how I connected with them. I said, hey, let's do more together, right? Because we eventually we need to make sure our clients are being successful. And Linda's reaction was exactly what I expected. She's like, yeah, why haven't we done this? Like, let's figure this out. So Linda and I
I
have
love
had
that.
2 or 3 calls now where we're trying to pick on certain common clients and saying, yeah, here are the challenges we're having with each other. Let's figure out a way to navigate that. And they've been extremely productive, right? It's not meant to be you're not doing this or I'm not doing this. It's more of these are the challenges. Let's figure out a way to navigate this because eventually it's going to help our clients. And I think the more we can do that, and the more we don't have to worry about, okay, we compete with server on certain things. I'm like, yeah, that's great, but let's leave that at the door. Let's figure out what we need to do for this client because the client's mandating what kind of a service model
Yeah.
they need, and let's help evolve that so that can be delivered in the way it is expected. So I think the more we can do that, the more we are educating ourselves with the challenges. I think the the fundamental thing is sometimes you think, oh, the RMC is not doing this because of X, Y, Z reason, but sometimes you realize no, their hands are tied because they're not getting the data that they're supposed to be getting on a timely basis. That then has a downstream impact. I think once you create that clarity, if you can give me this data, then they can go back to wherever the data originates from and says, we really
Yeah.
need this data because not only I can navigate that data as an RMC, but maybe the tax and the immigration team needs it a little bit more. It's more important for them than it is for me. So I need you to help double down on the data that's being provided and the integrity of that data. So I think it's really, really productive in how we're trying to create this evolution of
Hmm.
getting together and working together. And honestly, I think we've had some phenomenal discussions with other people in the ecosystem. And in general, I think once you get over that initial suspicion, like what is this person up to? What are they trying to get? And you realize that no, like the
Yeah.
end goal is making the client more successful. I think that's when everything comes together and people collaborate without worrying about, is there look, I think there's enough business for everyone, right? So we don't have to worry about is
Yeah.
X going to do this or Y going to do this. We just have to make sure our clients are
No.
successful. And honestly, that's what our clients are expecting of us, right? They're expecting that of us. They're telling us play well in the sandbox and continue to push the needle and create more efficiencies for us.
For sure. And at the end of the day, like my philosophy through life is always around assume ignorance and not malice.
Yeah,
Like I'm never going to have the assumption that, oh, you're not doing this because of X. It's like, no, you might have different things that you have to take care of, and that's okay. As long
yeah,
as I might need to nudge you
yeah,
every now and then, or you might need to nudge me
yeah,
back then. But what I'm hearing is we should now have a roundtable amongst the service providers ourselves to figure out how to work better with each other, which I am all for it.
yeah,
And it seems like you and Linda have had conversations that this is, something that we should start to really, work through together because at the end of the day, the better outcome is for our clients,
yeah,
right? We're going to figure things out
yeah,
together based on our own subject matter
yeah,
experts. And so I think, this is kind of a good way to, this is kind of like a nice little, reminder and a little lesson that we're learning, not just from tax, but
yeah.
just from, an awareness of the corporate structure and the employee, duty of care, but also what is the right balance for the business. And so I think if there's any last piece of word that you could say before we turn this off, I'd love to hear it. Any hot tip or any last pieces that you wanna say before we end this?
Life tip is sleep well, hydrate well. No, I'm kidding. Uh, look. I think for anyone who's been in our business, whether you've been in the business for 30 years like me or have been in the business for a few years, I think you very quickly realize that our industry is probably going through constant evolution, right? There's constant change, whether it's technology, whether it's what we experienced during the pandemic, whether it's the impact on volumes, right, that we've seen over the last few years. There's a constant change. There's something going on all the time, right? And I think it's just having the ability to be nimble, right, to react and to,
Mm.
I think to use the term that you used earlier, right, which was very popular in the pandemic, pivot, right, to be able to pivot very quickly and not be stuck in doing things in a certain way. I think is going to be important. And look, it's true for, and maybe I'm biased because I'm in Silicon Valley and I see tech change all the time, right? And constant
Oh
changes,
yeah.
right? We've got the iPhone 17 that probably is coming out soon. So there is this constant focus, and you can go back even 10 years ago, right? Or 15 years ago, where we were still using the fax machine. Nobody uses the fax machine today. Everything is on email, right? So to think that a lot of what we do and the way we operate is changing constantly, and to be able to have the ability to navigate that and to embrace it. And look, sometimes there will be changes that will not go through, will fail, but I think we all have to be nimble to make sure that we can pivot and continue to grow and make this industry what it really is. Look, it's an incredible industry. We do some incredible things across the ecosystem. Our clients do some incredible things. We move some of the most smartest people in the world, right, as part of
Yeah,
mobility, and I think
yeah,
that's a privilege that we get. But it's we then have to make sure that we're able to keep up with what they experience, right? If someone's using the iPhone 16 and our technology is not keeping up with what they are used to, you're going to hear about it, right? You're going to hear about it.
oh yeah,
So I think that's that constant ability to navigate uh, innovation, automation, and all of those things. I think is really really critical in my mind.
that's great. No, that was brilliant. Thank you, Rajiv. This was such a pleasure to have you on our show. Once again, thank you for listening to Surface Soundbites. If you enjoy the show, please click subscribe and share, and be sure to come back next time. If you have any other topics that you want to touch on, it sounds like maybe there might be a little bit of an AI. I met Stephen in Seattle a few months ago, so he's deep into that technology piece. So, more connections between our groups, that would be great. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop us a note at servicesoundbites@serva.com. But otherwise, this is Judee and Rajiv, and don't forget, Server provides everything you needed to move talent and deliver experience. And KPMG is there as a partner along the way. So thank you again.
Thank you.
All right. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.